so I guess we're going to have to pick it up a little bit. Last week we talked about the Battle of Gallipoli, and Gallipoli was one of those things that was probably great strategy. Unfortunately, the execution was horrible on it. With the idea of trying to force the Dardanelles with Navy ships was a brilliant thought. It came that close to succeeding, but as they were almost through, they almost were there, they decided they couldn't do it and they backed off. And so defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory. How the war might have changed if Gallipoli had turned out differently. If they could truly have gone on to Constantinople, knocked the Turks out of the war, that was going to open up the supply lines to Russia. Who knows what might have happened had Russia been better supplied by the Allies? And so we might have had a completely different outcome. Who knows what with the revolution may never have occurred. You can what if it to death. It's unknown and unknowable, but it was a brilliant strategy. Unfortunately, the execution was quite poor on it, and a lot of good men were sacrificed hanging on those beaches for months and months and months. Victory has 1,000 fathers. Defeat is an only child. And somebody has to take the blame. Churchill took the blame for it, was removed from his cabinet post as Lord of the Admiralty, and ended up going to France as a lieutenant colonel, commanding a brigade, or a regiment rather, and spent time in the trenches, actually led raids out into no man's land, patrols at night. He was very involved with the war. Then he came back and became Minister of Munitions because they realized they were running out of ammunition and need somebody to run that, and so Churchill did that and performed admirably in that role. We also talked about the beginnings of the Battle of Verdun. At Verdun, this was good old General Falkenhayn. Remember, Moltke was the German head of the German general staff at the beginning of the war. Unfortunately, when the Schlieffen Plan came unraveled for them and they were stopped at the Battle of the Marne, he suffered what was really a nervous breakdown. His nerves just couldn't stand it. The man was 66 years old, and he'd been through a pretty tough few months of the war, and so his nerves broke. He was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn, the gentleman here on the left. Now, Falkenhayn's got a plan. And Falkenhayn's plan is to find a spot in the French lines where they know the French cannot afford to let them pass and that they will hold at all costs. And the spot he picks is Verdun. At Verdun, is a fortress city built after, really, most of the fortifications are fairly modern. They were built after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And so they guard the plains of Champagne, which is the gateway to the city of Paris. So Falkenhayn knows that the French cannot afford, under any circumstances, to let Verdun fall. So his plan is to attack on a very, very small front. Cover that front with massive artillery and bleed the French white at Verdun. That's the plan. That's the plan. Here's Verdun. You can see the salient right here. Germans were kind of all around it. And so in February of 1916, out of the mist come hordes of gray-clad German soldiers. The French are not prepared. Remember the horrible debacle at Fort Douaumont? It wasn't even manned. There wasn't even an officer there. They had stripped it of all of its guns. And it is the linchpin of the French defense lines. It is captured without firing a shot by a sergeant who just walked in an open door and began to round up the 68 people that were there. It cost the French 200,000 killed and wounded to recapture Fort Douaumont. which they finally did some 7 months later. But Verdun it didn't work out quite like Falkenhayn had planned. In fact, the Germans took more casualties than the French did. It bled both armies white. It lasted for over 10 months. It was the longest battle of the war. 1 million killed and wounded on both sides. They don't really know how many were killed and wounded. It's kind of hard to tell. But near as we can tell, you see numbers anywhere from 800,000 to 1 million casualties. But however many there were, it was a horrible amount. If you ever go to France and you've not been there, it is well worth seeing. It's about, 90 miles east of Paris, I guess, something like that. It's a good road, easy to get to. But you can still walk the fields today, and you can still see the shell holes. There were some 45 million artillery rounds fired in that 10 months. That's 150,000 per day, almost 2 every second. So the Germans found that the French could play that artillery game as well as they could. And so the French brought their artillery in, and it just turned into a killing ground for both armies. But it did hold. The two French commanders that made their names at Verdun, Pétain, Henri Pétain, which we remember now from World War II, right? He was the Marshal of France. Unfortunately, the great reputation that he built during World War I, unfortunately, by collaborating with the Germans and the Vichy regime, he ruined it in World War II. But Pétain is probably the man in the war. If any one man saved France in World War I, there's a good case to be made that it was Pétain. Because the next year we're going to talk about the horrible failed offenses of the French army. And the French army breaks, and you actually have mutiny in the French army. Pétain was sent in to quell that mutiny, to heal the wounds, and get the French army back to fighting again, which he did, and he did magnificently. So this wonderful service he gave in World War I, unfortunately, was kind of wiped out by collaboration in World War II. But if any man could be said to save France during the war, Pétain is a pretty good candidate for that honor. Now, the direct commander, Pétain was the commander at Verdun. He was moved up to command the Central Army Group. Robert Nivelle took his spot and performed brilliantly in the defense of Verdun. He was an artillery expert, and he's the one that really masterminded the French artillery attacks on the Germans and used artillery very, very effectively at Verdun. He rose the next year to command the French armies. Unfortunately, it was a very short stay. He had this offensive that he planned that was a total disaster, that the French were slaughtered, and thus the mutinies began. And so Pétain's being in charge of the French army, his reign there was rather short and absolutely not very sweet. It was a disastrous situation for France. Some scenes from Verdun. You can see a very famous picture in the upper left here. You can see the French under attack. French are attacking the Germans there. It's actually a German photograph, and you can see a French soldier at the moment of his being hit there. On the left, you see the Germans attacking. In the background, if you notice, you can see a new weapon that they had uncovered at Verdun, the flamethrower. Terrified the French when they first ran into it. On the right, we talked about the only road. The Germans had cut the French railroad with artillery. There was one way to supply Verdun, one road, and it became known as the Sacred Road or the Sacred Way. And you can see French trucks and French soldiers, 24 hours a day. That road was packed with French troops moving in and out and moving supplies up. It was the only way to get supplies into Verdun for months. Finally, later on in the summer, they were able to complete a small railway, and so they took some of the strain off of the road. But 24 hours a day, French were moving troops in, supplies in, and it all went along this one small road. And it's the only thing that kept Verdun supplied. The killing in Verdun, the battle was so intense because it all took place on just a front that was just a few miles wide. It was so intense that no division, no French infantry division could stay there very long because you just got chewed up too fast. And so the French began to move divisions in and out of Verdun on a regular basis, and some 70% of all of the French infantry troops served at Verdun. So they moved them all in and out on a regular basis because the fighting was so intense there. But it turned out to be Falkenhayn's strategy worked. Unfortunately, it worked kind of in reverse too, and so both armies were just bled white there. If you go there, you'll see the cemetery with the memorial, and in the memorial is the famous ossuary. You can see it on the right, where the remains, the skeletal remains of some 136,000 men, French and Germans mixed together, unidentifiable. So they just took all the bones and put them in this one room, and you can actually go see it. It's a tragic thing.
You had said how the French got resupplied, and both for manpower and supplies. How were the Germans able to keep up the supply and weapons?
They had Verdun is very close to the German border, okay. So they had their railroads. They could run them right up to the border, and then they had roads and railway supply into their troops as well. So they were better prepared really to supply their troops than the French were. The French had one road. The Germans had better supply into their troops because they were so close to the German border there. Now, while Verdun is going on, the French are in desperate shape. They're just holding on by their fingernails. And the French are desperate for some type of action to take the pressure off of them at Verdun. And thus comes, starting in July the 1st, 1916, right in the middle of the Battle of Verdun, the British began their great offensive at the Somme. July the 1st, 1916. Here's Verdun. Here's the Somme area over here. Remember, this part of the trench line up to about here is British. The rest of it is French. Probably about 2-to-1 French. The French had a lot more territory to defend, had more soldiers than the British did. Remember, at the beginning, the British had a very small little army, only about 150,000 men. The Germans referred to it as the contemptible little army, and the survivors called themselves the old contemptibles. And so, but the British army now is being replaced. Most of those men are gone, quite frankly. The war's been going on now for almost 2 years. Most of those original guys are not with us anymore. And so now we have the new army, the Kitchener Army, if you will. And many of those units are made up with what they call PALS battalion. You could sign up with your friends. And so a unit would be consisting of, it may be all East London. It may be all a unit from Leeds or York or someplace where everybody knew each other. And that's why when you go to these small little villages in Britain and you see the World War I memorial, there'd be a village of just a few hundred people, but there'll be 56 names on that memorial. An astounding number of people from just a small area. Now, the Somme was originally planned. In fact, the Somme was going to be the big French and British operation of 1916. It's going to be a joint operation and massive breakthrough. They just kept planning these massive breakthroughs, and with the cavalry waiting to go through the breach and spread out. And they kept planning them, and the cavalry kept marching, kept bunching up back there, but it just never quite happened. They just couldn't punch through those lines. They were too deep, too much barbed wire, too much artillery, too many machine guns. And so They kept trying, but it just didn't work out for them. But the great push in 1916 was going to be at the Somme. It was going to be a joint British-French operation. Unfortunately, in February, the Germans strike at Verdun, and the French now are begging for help. And so this becomes now primarily 2-to-1 a British operation to try to get pressure off of the French at Verdun. The French had troops there too, but it was about a 2-to-1 British operation at the Somme. Now, the British commander now, Sir John French was the original commander. At the end of 1915, he's replaced by Haig. And so Haig is now the commander. He will stay the British commander for the rest of the war. And if you remember the Haig whiskey family, yep, he's from that family. He's a Scotsman. And so that's his family. And so Haig has planned this enormous bombardment. Goes on for days. And for days, the British pound the German lines. July the 1st, early in the morning, 1916, 13 divisions go over the top for the British. Now, the British have been planned, the soldiers have been told, it's going to be a walkover. We've destroyed their barbed wire, we've destroyed their trench lines. You should be able to walk over to the front lines and just occupy them. One young lieutenant actually came out leading his men, kicking a soccer ball across no man's land. Neither the young lieutenant nor the soccer ball ever returned. The Germans, where the British attacked, the Germans were in about twice the strength that the British thought they were. The Germans had been there for some year and a half, and they had not been idle. They had been entrenched deeply. They had 30-foot deep bunkers that were artillery-proof. And so when the British hit, the Germans poured out of their bunkers, the machine guns were untouched, the artillery began to fall, and the slaughter began. July the 1st, 1916 was the bloodiest day in the history of warfare. In that one day, the British suffered 20,000 men killed, additional 40,000 wounded. It was a horror show. They were just slaughtered by machine gun fire. In some places, the infantry had a mile to cover from their trenches to the German trenches. The Tyndale Irish Brigade went over the top, started there. They were a mile away from the German trenches. Not one soldier reached the German lines. The Newfoundland Brigade, 780 men went over the top. The next day at roll call, 68 were there to answer the roll call. 700 plus were killed and wounded. Over 500 of them were killed. A whole generation of Newfoundlanders died that morning. It was a horror show for the British.
What about the Germans? They have any support from other countries?
I'm sorry, did they have?
What about the Germans? Do they have any reinforcements from other countries at all?
Well, remember now, Germany is allied with Austria-Hungary and Turkey.
And Turkey.
And later on, Bulgaria.
Okay, so they had what percentage of all this was non-German, would you say?
Well, on the Western Front, it was exclusively German.
Okay.
The Austro-Hungarians fought the Italians, they fought the Russians.
Right, okay.
And so the Germans were on both fronts. The Eastern Front, we're going to talk about the Eastern Front in just a few minutes. But so it was strictly a German show on the Western Front.
Eastern Front.
But then the Austro-Hungarians, they were fighting the Russians and then the Italians on their southern front. So what we're going to find out too is that in this horrible war of attrition, the French and the British were able to make up their losses better than the Germans were. So in a war of attrition, Germany was going to lose that war. and which is exactly what they got into. And question.
On the map, could you show where the Battle of Somme is?
The Battle of the Somme is right here.
And the other one, Verdun?
Verdun is here.
Okay, thank you.
That's Verdun.
And how far apart?
is Paris?
From here to here, as the crow flies, is maybe 100 miles. It's about 90 or 100 miles from Paris to Verdun, and so it's about the same from between those two. So somewhere in the 100. Tom.
When the General Staff on the Allies side determined that this is a war of attrition, and I can't imagine it took them long not to figure that out, it seems to me that they changed the game and go to a naval invasion somewhere else to just require the Germans to concentrate their forces across a wider front. Open up second supply lines, the kinds of things that would just bleed them materially until basically the war of attrition would fall in on itself.
Well, that Gallipoli was part of that thought, but where are you going to land troops? The problem is that there was a plan to land French and British troops in northern Germany, but it turned out when they looked at it, it was impossible because you had the German fleet right up there, blocking the entrance to the Baltic. So they couldn't figure any way to get past the German fleet. So where else are you going to land? There really was no place else to.
Goes to Switzerland.
yeah. The port of Zurich, right? No place to come in there. So anyway, for 4.5 months, the British, the French went at the Germans at the Somme. It was half the length of the Battle of Verdun, but with equal casualties. It was really a horror show. They made some progress. The French were attacking against. They made more progress than the British did because the defenses were less south of the Somme where they were attacking. The British attacked north of the Somme where the defenses were much stronger. And they, at the end of this thing, for a million plus people, casualties, killed and wounded, they gained about 6 miles on the average of the trench, which in World War I was one of the bigger, one of the larger gains. Some scenes from the Somme, very famous picture here. It's actually a still from a movie. If you've watched World War I, you may see this guy carrying this wounded. These are the British trenches. Here's a scene from the German trenches. Notice the difference. Notice the difference. The Germans viewed the trenches. They knew they were going to be for a good while on the defensive in France, on the Western Front. They were going to knock Russia out and then come back to France. Their strategy, we see, is going to completely change. But notice the difference in the German trenches and the British. The British and the French viewed the trenches as temporary. They were on the offensive. They were only a place to jump off from. The Germans knew they were going to be there for a good while, and they were going to be. They needed to be on the defensive, and so plus they picked the better ground. The British were in this swampy stuff where you dug down and hit water, and it was just horrible land. The Germans were always on the higher ground, in the chalkier, better digging place, drier trenches. A famous scene. It's actually again still shots from. You see these quite regularly. It's a shot of a British group going over the top on the first day of the war. And you can see one has already dropped. They're just trying to get through their wire now. And they've already lost one. It's a series, and as the series goes on, you see more and more of them falling. Very, very, it's when you see it, it's quite heart-wrenching. Now, the Somme also was the introduction of the tank. The first use of the tank in warfare. On September the 15th, the British had 49 tanks. And we all know who was the proponent of using the tank. Winston Churchill. He was not the he didn't invent it, but he had been in France, and he knew there had to be some way to get infantry across that killing ground without having them protect them from machine gun fire and shrapnel and to something that could crunch through the wire. And so when somebody came up with this, he was an enthusiastic supporter of it. And in fact, the name tank comes from the code name. They used Admiralty funds to develop it, and they gave it a code name of water tanks. So to kind of hide what they were doing, and so it surprised the heck out of the Germans. Unfortunately, they only had 49 of them. Of the 49, they got 32 actually to the jumping off point before mechanical troubles took them out of the game. 17 of them broke down on the way, just getting them from the depot up to the front line. Another 11 of them couldn't start, so only 21 of them actually took place in the battle. They terrified the Germans when they saw them. They absolutely terrified the Germans. But they had a lot of real bad flaws. They could only move at about 3 miles an hour, 2 miles an hour. So, walking speed, if you will. So they were very slow. It took them forever to get across no man's land. The Germans found that the machine gun bullets just bounced off of them, but artillery didn't. And so the Germans very quickly learned to concentrate their artillery fire on the tanks, and they could knock them out fairly quickly with artillery fire. So they were very vulnerable to that. But also, being inside a tank was just about as unpleasant as being on outside of a tank. They had an engine in there, a big gasoline engine, putting out enormous amounts of heat, fumes. It was 130 degrees in there. The fumes were just awful, so you could hardly breathe. Being inside one of these things and closed up for any period of time was horribly, horribly uncomfortable and almost unbearable. So the British squandered their tank. There were too few of them. They achieved complete surprise, but they didn't have enough of them to take advantage of it. So in many ways they wasted the surprise and the shock value of the tank and just kind of threw that away.
Dave, was there any weaponry on the tank?
Oh, yeah.
Just a moment. Is that a weapon?
That's a 75 millimeter gun right there. And they had machine guns in there as well. They're kind of hard to see. Instead of a turret, they had kind of a bay window, if you will, on the side of it. Their armored bay window that they could fire, and they would have one on the other side as well. So they were armored, and they could had machine guns, and when they worked quite well. But unfortunately, the Germans quickly learned that they could concentrate their artillery fire, because you figure if it's a half a mile between trenches, it's going to take these guys, half an hour to get across 20 to 30 minutes to get across no man's land. Well, you can bring a lot of artillery to bear on a tank in 20 to 30 minutes, and so many of them they were able to knock out. So the Somme, again, 4.5 months, casualties equal Verdun. Over 1 million men killed and wounded at the Somme. Now, the Germans actually had more killed and wounded than the British and French did. So it turned into a bloodletting for both sides, but the Germans could not replace their losses. The British and the French could.
Why is that?
They just didn't have the population.
Okay.
Yeah, Germany was, 65 million. France and Britain together were more like 85 million. Plus Britain had all those territories.
Yes.
And they brought in Australians, New Zealand, they brought in Indian troops, Canadian, they kept bringing in all, and then plus the U.S. was getting ready to, at this time, was a year away from being in the war. The Germans viewed the Somme as the beginning, almost the beginning of the end. A couple of quotes from a couple of German soldiers who fought there. The Somme, the whole history of the world cannot contain a more ghastly word. And another one said the Somme was the muddy grave of the German field army. So again, it was a horrible